The second panel deals with not a less interesting issue, and that is the regional aspects as far as the deal is concerned. I have two panelists again, not the same, of course. One is Dr. Carlo Masala from the Bundeswehr University in Munich, and spent most of your life in Germany, no Canadian connection. Italian, yeah. And so we have one, this is on the left. On my right, I have Professor Meir Litvak, who is one of our top Iranologists, if I can invent this term, in an adjacent to us university. We are very much, this institute is very much affiliated with the Tel Aviv University and the Dayan Center, in which Meir is also very active. So, to the question. Is Iran perceived, following the JCPOA, by the regional players, those who matter, as a winner in this deal?
By the regional players, absolutely yes. Most regional players believe that the US has sold out to Iran, that Iran basically got what it wants. They completely distrust Iran. They believe that they don't believe in Iran compliance with the deal. There is fear that the US has forsaken the Arabs in favor of Iran, and they have great fear that Iran will have, I would say, international, if not support, then at least looking the other way, that will enable Iran to pursue whatever it wants in the region.
Professor Masala, do you accept the assessment of Professor Litvak? And secondly, when you read the interview, I don't know whether it was mentioned today, but I certainly advise you to read this interview in the Atlantic magazine that Obama gave Jeffrey Goldberg. Really, it's a long one, it's 72 pages, but it's still worth reading. And there, you can't but feel that Obama doesn't really like the Saudis. And what we heard from Professor Litvak is that it's mutual. They don't like him either. And the question is, will it influence, will it go to the next, this mutual feeling, will it go, continue with the next president? And what does it mean in terms of dealing with Iran by the international community? Certainly if they caught up violating the agreement.
I mean, first of all, I totally do agree with my colleague. And one indication, is the mic on?
Yeah.
Yeah. And one indication, for instance, is also that when President Obama invited the head of states of 4 GCC countries to Camp David to explain what in the deal, they sent their deputies. So, which shows to what extent they were unsatisfied with closing the deal with Iran. If you go in other corners of the region, Iran is definitely seen as the winner of this gamble. I would totally agree. If it comes to Saudi Arabia, I think we are back with the current administration and with the future administration, and even if we look at the Europeans, and I come from Germany, especially also with the Germans, we are back at a certain level of realpolitik. No one likes the Saudis, but there is no other alternative to balance the Iranian ambitions of gaining suzerainty over the region. So that's why we will continue working together with the Saudis, knowing that they are pretty much unreliable, that they create a lot of trouble in other areas by financing certain groups which promoting Wahhabism worldwide, but we have no alternative there. So if the policy will be to counterbalance Iranian influence in the region, we will rely on the Saudis. My feeling, having read the Obama interview too, and I look at you, Tom, sorry for that, is that the current administration in the US, and I'm not talking about the future administration, could live with partly Iranian suzerainty over certain parts of the region. So, I mean, they're not working really hard to support the Saudis in their efforts to counterbalance this attempt. So, but this is my gut feeling. I have no indications from Washington that this is the case, but if I read the interview, if I read what Obama says about Saudi Arabia, if I look at the actual policies, it could be done much more to empower the Saudis. If you don't want to engage directly in the region to counterbalance the Iranian, it could be done much more to empower the Saudis to do that, or other GCC countries together with the Saudis. This is not done. So my assessment would be partly the deal paved the way for the Iranians to push harder for gaining suzerainty over the region. And this is one, sorry to interrupt you, this is what I say. I mean, we know in international relations this concept of unintended consequences. I don't know that this was in the back of the mind of the US administration, but that's the result of the deal. The result of the deal is that Iran is now in a better position to try to gain suzerainty over the region.
And basically what you are saying is that the West, quote unquote, is basically relying on this pillar, I say it cynically, called Saudi Arabia.
Yes. Yes. Fully knowing that you can't trust them and that they might collapse in the near future. So therefore I said this is not a coherent policy. It is trying to push back the Iranians on certain levels, like in Yemen, like in Syria. On the other hand, welcoming silently the support of the Iranians in Iraq, because they do the job the West is not ready to do with regard to ISIS and other forces in Iraq. But if Saudi Arabia collapses for certain reasons or doesn't pursue this policy any longer in counterbalancing the Iranians, I think there is this tendency to accept a certain amount of influence of Iran in the region.
This is a major conclusion. This is,
I know.
Meir?
I agree. I think there's, I would like to add to this point, I think there's not only within this administration, or maybe there's a green light with this administration, I would sense a certain sense of, I would call it, not fatigue, but disenchantment from the Saudis. You can see it in an article in the New York Times which accuses the Saudis of fomenting Wahhabism all over the world. It's not a coincidence that it appears after the Obama's interview and so on. When all of a sudden Britain has to apologize for selling weapons to the Saudis, the Saudis have now a bad image in the West because of seem partially responsible for radical Sunni Islam, one thing. Secondly, I think Iran enjoys a favorable image because compared to ISIS, and ISIS projects on the Muslims, on the Sunnis, the Shias and Iran all of a sudden perceived to be as the responsible, rational, reliable Middle Eastern power. They are what we call in Israel the responsible elder in the Middle East, compared to the lunatic Sunnis, adult. Secondly is I think that because now there is great fear, greatest fear is ISIS and Sunni terrorism in the US, in the West, the fact that Iran is fighting ISIS, there is much greater tolerance to what Iran is doing in Syria, completely. I think that today the US prefers Assad to stay in power and therefore...
Meir, hold on for a second. Please explain to us, or a hearing device, but explain to us, if we follow the assessment of both of you, what does it, how do you translate it in the case of Syria? Does it mean that basically Iran can call the future of the various alternatives of configuring the Middle East?
No, I don't think that Iran can. I think there are also limits to Iranian power. And with all due respect to the Iranians, there are very important structural limits to their power that we're not going to change. I think that if I take Syria, I don't think that Iran will call the shots in Syria because now Russia is a major player, and I think that there's some tension between Russia and in Iran over Syria. But now Iran is recognized as a legitimate player in Syria, as an indispensable player in Syria. And if many people in the West...
Regardless of what the Saudis think about.
Yes, because I think many Westerners believe now that the alternatives in Syria are either ISIS or Assad, and they prefer Assad to stay over ISIS. And if this is the alternative that now is perceived or portrayed in the Middle East, then certainly Iran enjoys influence. Now, it's not that Iran will dictate who will participate and who will not. I think here Russia has probably greater leverage. Basically, I think the US gave up Syria to the Russians to be the major decision makers. Iranian role is now recognized as a legitimate and even positive role in Iran, in Syria and Iraq.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
Iran is not.
Although I'm quite shocked as it is.
The Iranians are not calling the shots in Syria. I absolutely do agree, but they will get a legitimate place at the table once there will be some kind of negotiation. It might be too early to give them this place officially, but they will be part of a solution. Yeah, and partly they were given. So, at the same, I said Iraq. I mean, if you look at American reactions to Iranian involvement in Iraq, it's basically a blessing. I mean, it's not an opposition, because the US is happy that the Iranians are doing partly the job of the West in Iraq in helping the current regime in pushing back ISIS and other extremist forces. So they are accepted as a legitimate player in the whole Middle Eastern Gulf game. So which brings them back to actually a status they didn't enjoy since '79, since the revolution. So, and it plays in the Iranian hands because if they play it clever, and the Iranians are not stupid, as we heard also from the previous panel, they can at least pretend to be a responsible player in finding solutions which suits basically everyone who has an interest in that country. And this is part of their game in gaining more influence, in gaining, at the end of the day, suzerainty. What I think that the nuclear deal, how the nuclear deal plays in, whenever, and we will have these situations in the future, whenever the US or Europeans, I would say the US mostly, are trying to push back Iranian influence too hard, they can threaten with the agreement and their obedience to the agreement and basically getting out or defect from the agreement in order to get something else politically. So there is a linkage, and this is the unintended consequences. There is a linkage between the deal and Iranian policy in the region. And this is basically why I said the deal supports that the Iranian can step up in their effort in doing in the region what they try to do and what basically the ultimate goal is.
But for that, they have to keep to the letter the agreement. Because if they violate the agreement, they lose this position.
Yeah, but there is no need for them currently to violate the agreement.
I agree.
If they get politically what they want at the later stage, I mean, if you want to be cynical, which I want to be right now, at a later stage, once they reached what they want politically, strategically, they can violate the agreement and pursue the military road. And then basically they cement their strategic position in the region and change, of course, the strategic equation, being the second nuclear power in the region. So, probably the second, so we don't know.
I will come to it in a minute. But Meir, was it, I'm coming to it, was it worse for Israel, this trade-off? Basically, you two are saying there was a trade-off, intended, unintended. The result is Iran gave up, at least temporarily, the nuclear project and gained the position that both of you described in the Middle East. From the Israeli point of view, if you have to make a decision, somebody asked you a year ago, this is your choice. What do you go for?
Which choice? Between what?
Between an Iranian with reduced current capability, nuclear capability, as against a more prominent role in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert on Israeli policy. I mean, I don't, I
Tell
try
me
to study.
who is.
No, everyone in Israel is an expert in Israeli policy. I study the Arabs or the Iranians. Let me put it this way. I think Israel mishandled the way it fought the agreement, and it lost possible leverage on influencing the agreement at some point, the way it conducted its policy. Let's put it this way. First of all, some of the processes we have described actually were taking place before the agreement or unrelated to the agreement. Again, the dilemma in the middle is between, let's say, Assad or ISIS is unrelated to the agreement. This is something that would have happened anyway. This is what Assad was pursuing for the past 5 years, and it was unrelated to the agreement. The same thing in Iraq. So some of these processes are not, unrelated. Now, I was one who always believed, by the way, that in the long run, the victory of Assad in Syria was not in our benefit, in our interest, in the long run. I was one who, from the beginning of the, let's say, events in Syria, hoped that Assad would lose. It didn't happen, probably will not happen now, but I thought, and I still believe that in the long run, Iran poses a greater strategic threat to Israel in the long run than the Sunnis. And but again, what is happening is partly totally unrelated to the agreement. The agreement helped it, it reinforced it, it did not produce it.
If, and I assume the audience accepts your assessment, and it's very difficult not to accept it, are we trying to talk to the weaker Saudis who have very little influence, and you expect them, or the U.S. expects them much too much to compare to their capability or willingness? Are we trying to talk to the wrong people rather than to the Saudis? We should talk to the Iranians?
I doubt very much. I mean, we can talk to the Iranians, they would not listen to us and would not answer, because I think that there's no chance of any rapprochement between Israel and Iran.
No, I'm not speaking about rapprochement.
No. I think the Iranians.
I'm speaking about a quiet dialogue.
No. I don't believe that it's possible a quiet dialogue between us and the Iranians. They totally reject it, and I don't think that as long as Khamenei is in office, there's any chance of changing Iran policy toward Israel. I think we are probably talking to the Saudis. We have many shared interests with the Saudis and others. But I would make one qualification. I think that our relations with or shared interests with the Arab countries can lead to some sort of cooperation, but up to a limit, as long as there is no progress on the Palestinian issue, because it puts limitations on what Arab governments can do. I'll put it very bluntly and politically incorrectly. We are the mistress that you keep out on the side, but in secret, because you cannot show your face as long as the current situation between us and the Palestinians continues. I'm not saying that, let's say, that we can have peace tomorrow, but unless there's some progress or perception of progress, then the Saudis and other Gulf countries cannot bring to the public whatever under the table negotiations they're having with us, or talks with us.
Are we talking to the wrong guys? Or
No,
trying to talk to the wrong?
No, I mean, I don't think that you're talking to the wrong people. And I think you will start talking to the Iranians once there is this kind of regional bipolarity, which is on the horizon. And then you will have your dialogue with the
Or
Iranians.
tripolarity, if you bring, or quadruple, if you bring in Egypt and Turkey.
Well, I would say, I mean, honestly, from my perspective, if you look at material capabilities, if you look at political stability, I mean, of the regimes, I would say Egypt is, for the time being, not one of the major players in the whole region. Egypt has its role, and it is important for you with regard to the Gaza Strip and Hamas and whatever that there is going on. But Egypt is, for the time being, not a central player if you look at the region. The central player in the region, which is basically on its rise, is Iran. Once you have this kind of bipolarity, or however you want to call it, you will have your dialogue. For the time being, since I would assume not being an Israeli expert, neither an Israeli, I would assume that it works like it always works. You have a common enemy, the Saudis and you, and most of the Gulf countries, which is Iran. So, and you will cooperate with them to a certain extent. There might be the Palestinian issue. I would even say if you solve the Palestinian issue, not much will happen with regard to the official relations, because it will basically, I mean, I can assume that the day the Palestinian issue, however, is solved, and the Saudis will start having official relations with Israel, they will have a major problem domestically. So they're not going to talk to Israel through official channels. So you have to keep the dialogue in a certain extent secret and the cooperation or quiet. But you talk to the right people because you face a common threat, a common enemy. So therefore the strategy is the right one. Yeah? And it will, the question is, will the region be able to push the Iranians back? And there is a big question mark because you need support from the international community. And I have some doubts whether the international community has an interest, a strong interest in pursuing this kind of policy. Because what we will see, and I mean, I'm just talking about the European countries, and there I have a slightly different perception than you. There is this run...
You're referring to
Andrea.
Okay.
There is this, I mean, what I read in the press, there is this interest and run into Iran by business. So, and the more trade you have, the more investment you will have, the stronger the lobby will be in certain European countries not to change policy vis-à-vis Iran. Yeah? So, therefore, I'm also skeptical that if in 10 years from now Iran violates the agreement, you know, sanctions will come back that easily from the European side. Because there, then, domestically speaking, economically speaking, Europe has a total different interest. If you look at the sanctions the EU imposed on Russia, it's now crumbling 3 years after, yeah, because major companies are pushing very hard to say nothing has changed, we are losing money on a day-to-day basis, we are losing jobs, yeah. So I can imagine, foreseen a similar scenario once industry is there, once business is there, Iran violates the agreement, then going back basically to square one and imposing sanctions, I'm just talking about the Europeans, will be an extremely difficult thing to do, I would say.
In the previous session, I appointed one of the panelists to the advisor of Clinton. I appoint you two as Clinton's advisors. And the question related to what you said, if the U.S. doesn't behave according to what Obama said in the interview, that basically, or Jeffrey Goldberg said following the conversation, that basically there's no U.S. interest in the Middle East anymore. But assuming that the U.S. finds a reason and an interest in the region, and now to combat, how do you combat the regained or increased Iranian influence in the region? How do you return it to acceptable dimensions? Is there a way that the West, once again, quote unquote, is capable of limiting the Iranian influence?
Well, I mean, if you talk about the West, which I don't accept as a concept, because I think the West doesn't exist anymore, was an artificial concept of the Cold War.
Yeah.
So we can talk about the US. And of course, it very much depends on what the next administration will define as its strategic interest in the Middle East and in the Gulf. So, and if the strategic interest, and now I go back really to, I mean, U.S. history since the
But as an advisor, forgive me for interrupting, as an advisor, you just said that the Saudis cannot be expected to fulfill the role that Obama sort of unwillingly gave them.
No, the point is that you have to define strategically very clear that you don't accept any hegemon in the region. So if this is your strategic goal, then you start working on a bilateral level in creating stronger alliances. And the Saudis needs to be in. Of course, you always need to know the Saudis are not very reliable. You need probably to cut a deal in I mean, being tough on them and stopping financing Wahhabism worldwide, but you need basically to focus on the GCC to get their guts together. There is some potential there. I mean, it's a Saudi-dominated organization. You need to encourage basically the quiet talks between certain countries in the region which don't have any bilateral relations officially. And then, in that perspective, you design policies in pushing back the Iranian influence over Syria, over Lebanon, and then also over Hamas. So, but the point is, you need to define very clear at the beginning your strategic interest. And this should be, we can't accept any hegemon in the Arab world, which is a hostile, by the way, hostile hegemon in the Arab world. So if you don't do this, then of course, I mean, you have not that much influence in the region, because they will most of the countries will rally around you if you have a clear-cut strategic interest and you demonstrate that you are serious in pursuing it, which the Obama administration never did in that sense. They never formulated a very clear-cut strategic interest in the Middle East. If they did, I mean, I remember August 2013, the red line which was drawn, which turned out to be a purple, a pink line.
On Syria.
So on Syria. So this is not something where you basically show your commitment to a region, where you show that you are serious in pursuing certain policies. And if there is an interest, the US need to go back to that interest and to this strategic vision for a region.
Meir?
Okay, before getting money for being an advisor, I would say two things. First of all, I don't think the US can leave the Middle East. If the US...
Honor is not sufficient?
Yeah, okay. I'll accept the honor. The US cannot leave the Middle East, because if the US will leave the Middle East will come to the West. Okay, the problem is...
Already there.
Okay, but it will be much worse. Yeah. That is, the world cannot ignore the problems of the Middle East, because it will then come elsewhere. And this has to be addressed, one thing. Secondly, with all due respect to the Iranians, how powerful they are, there are limits to their power. The Iranians are not all powerful. There are structural limits to Iranian power. Because they are Shias and the majority is Sunni, because they are not Arabs, they automatically, and he fully agree, they produce, I would say, animosity toward them. And this will affect their capabilities.
Meir, comes the issue of the police. Oh no, I want to specify, or to sharpen one point. Comes the issue of the future regime in Syria. The Iranians are dominant or not?
I agree that, unfortunately, now the Iranians will have an important share in deciding what will happen in Syria. Okay, that has been decided because the Americans, again, and the Europeans have decided that Assad is preferable to ISIS. I said it. And again, but I think that we still have to recognize because, let's say, take Iraq. Iraq is very, the Shias in Iraq cannot achieve this kind of hegemony they would have liked because there are too many Sunnis and there are too many Kurds in Iraq, okay? It's impossible to impose, let's say, complete Shia domination in Iraq as they would have wished. Therefore, it is, for instance, important that the US will support the Kurds in Iraq, in Syria, as a counterbalance against the Iranians, for the Kurds, also against ISIS, etc. Now, also it's important the Americans would support those more rational Arab states. I fully agree about the Saudis, what you said, and I fully agree that Egypt is in a very bad state. But you don't have to make it worse for Egypt. Sisi is not a perfect Democrat, but I think the Americans have made mistakes vis-a-vis Sisi. They alienated the Egyptians by their policy. And they should change their policy. They should change their policy toward Egypt. They should be much more be proactive with Jordan, more supportive of Jordan, more supportive of other Arab states, helping them to stand up to Iran and also to ISIS. And therefore, there are certain things that the US can do and Europe can do to bring together those Arab countries that will stand up to Iran. And again, we have to remember that Iran is not all powerful. I would say Iran has been very successful so far in preserving its assets in Syria, in Iraq. Iran has not been able to, so far, expand its control over other areas. In Yemen, they have failed. By the way, I think luckily for them, because Yemen is a disaster. Whoever takes Yemen will have to feed 25 million people. But they have failed in Yemen. And they have also, they have problems, again, they have not achieved full victory in Syria yet. You can do something that will maybe force Assad to, again, to still produce some changes in Syria. So it's not, I don't think that Iranians are all powerful, that Iranian domination is a foregone conclusion. A lot can be done, and I think the Americans if they act in the right way, can do a lot. And again, because I don't think they can afford to abandon the Middle East.
And if I might add, there is one white elephant in the room where I really don't know, even if I would be an advisor, what to advise. And this is the future of Turkey in the region.
Yes.
So this is the future of Turkey. This is basically the kind of policy Erdogan has in mind and might change tomorrow morning and then change again the next day. But Turkey definitely...
It can change today. Today is the longest day in the year. So.
But the relations between the US and Turkey are decisive too to determine the future of the region. And he rightly mentioned, I mean, there is a potential new force on the horizon which might be very helpful in pushing the Iranians back, which are the Kurds. But then, of course, we have always the problem of the Kurds and Turkey. So, I mean, there is no easy fix for that. But I just wanted to bring Turkey back in because, I mean, although I think Erdogan and Turkey for a long time are a pain in the longer neck of the West, but they have an influence here in the region. And they exerted this influence and they can do it in a positive way. I mean, from an American perspective, and they can do it in a harmful way from an American perspective. So there need to be a new policy on Turkey with the next administration.
And which brings me to the continent you know best. Will that play in the calculations of Europe?
What, Turkey?
Turkey. As some sort of a balance to Iran.
Well, the point is that we don't know how to deal with Iran and we don't know how to deal with Turkey in Europe. So, I mean, you know, if you look at, for instance, the policy of Chancellor Merkel, which, I mean, is very much realpolitik driven with regard to the refugee crisis, but basically we tied ourselves on an unreliable ally, Turkey, in order to basically solve our problems with the refugee crisis. So we don't know how to deal with Turkey. We know that this country is important because of its geography, but we don't have any clear-cut policy with regard to Turkey. So, and I don't see anyone on the horizon. And I'm afraid that whether Britain will leave the European Union or not, the European Union over the next years will get weaker in terms of foreign and security policy. So, and won't be able, I mean, economically still be able to play a major role on the global scale. But politically, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of security policy, I'm quite skeptical if the role of the European Union will increase or stay as it is. I'm afraid that it will diminish over time because of the enormous difficulties Europe has since a couple of years.
Questions or remarks from the audience? Yes, please. Can you identify yourself, please?
My name is Mark Gibson from the Carnegie Endowment. I tend to know, in all of this discussion, there's been a kind of a disconnect. We started off by talking about the nuclear agreement and the need to have Iran implement the agreement, to have the powers vigorously enforce the agreement, to make sure that Iran stays on the reservation. At the same time, I'm hearing conversations, including in this session and elsewhere this morning and afternoon, about the need to contain Iran politically. We're hearing that the way forward for the region and for Israel is to make sure that Iran doesn't expand, it doesn't become a hegemon, it doesn't expand its influence, it doesn't have its way. But isn't there a potential contradiction in all of this? We're hemming in Iran, and we're telling the powers and the IEA and everyone else that Iran has to implement the deal. You're setting up a situation where your politics, your policies are making the nuclear program of that country more and more important to the leadership of Iran. The more you contain Iran and force it into the shoebox, the more important that nuclear program becomes. And at some point, if you contain them so effectively and so successfully, they may perceive sometime down the line, whether it's before the agreement ends or afterward, when the sanctions are released, that their best option is to restart their provocative nuclear activities, including an advanced nuclear program.
What is your alternative?
No, I'm not saying there's an alternative. I'm just surprised at how focused the discussion politically here is in forcing Iran into a box, okay? I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that if you do that successfully, the chances that Iran will react by violating the agreement or restarting its nuclear program will be greater. That's all.
Well, basically, I don't see any contradiction, Mark, because, I mean, my analysis says that with the nuclear deal, we basically, I mean, not myself personally, but the P5+1 accepted a greater role for the Iranians in the region. So this is the analysis. And there is a linkage Iran can make between the deal and its policies in the region. You heard the German ambassador who said, we don't forget what the Iranians are doing, and I'm not going to tolerate this. That's nice diplo talk. I see the reality is different. So my analysis is, we help the Iranians in what they want to have, regional suzerainty. That's my analysis. And if we don't like regional suzerainty, we have to push them back. And there are risks in that policy. But I think, as Emily said this morning, I mean, it was a tactical concession to sign the deal from the Iranian side. I mean, it is not that they gave up the idea of, at the end of the day, having a military or a weaponized program, or the going down the military route of this program. So that's my personal opinion. So it's a tactical concession. Of course, I mean, if the overwhelming interest is they have to stick to the deal, we have to do our utmost that they obey to the deal, then the political price we pay is to say, partly we have to let them off the hook and accept what they're doing in the region. And we can't push back because they always can make the linkage between, if you push us hard enough back on this issue, we threaten you to leave the deal, full stop. So then the overboard...
There is a catch 33, or not 22, 33, and that is you don't have sufficient regional tools to stop the Iranians.
Yeah, added to this. But you see, I mean, this is what I see in my analysis. There is this linkage the Iranian can do, and I think Emily said about deterrence. It's not only the deterring power they have within the contract, they have a deterring power with regard to their strategic ambitions and our abilities, to interfere with that. So, that's my analysis. Personally, I say, if the interest is in pushing them back, then we have to do certain things. So, I mean, I don't see any contradiction, because I think that the overwhelming interest of the US and Russia and Germany and whoever negotiates that deal is they have to stick to the damn deal. So, and the consequence is then we have to accept a certain price in the region.
Meir?
I think there's a difference between pushing the Iranians, let's say, to the box and justifying their paranoia that they are threatened. This is one thing. And secondly, accepting Iranian expansionism and aspirations for hegemony. There's a major difference. Iran can be told that no one threatens Iran, everyone respects Iran, Iran's sovereignty, honor, etc. But doesn't mean that Iran then can allow to do whatever it wants in the Middle East. I think there's a major difference between the two. One thing. Secondly, let's say as a selfish Israeli, if the price that for Iran would would play up with the deal is that then Iran can continue to call for our elimination and continue to supply missiles to Hezbollah and Hamas so they can use it against us, then as a selfish Israeli, I'm not sure that this is it's worth it. We'll be eliminated so Iran can feel wonderful and happy about it. Iran can be given all the respect and honor it deserves as a major state, respectable state, wonderful, respectable player in the international arena, but not as a hegemon. And there's a gap, and I think the Iranians should be told that there is a gap, and one thing does not give them the other.
I thank the panelists, I thank the audience for your patience. Thank you very much.